This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This week, we continue our series on peace, or the biblical concept shalom, especially in the Hebrew Bible. And last time we did a little bit of an overview of what is this peace, what makes it distinct, what's a biblical theological perspective. This week, we want to look at the various uses of this term. And I want to mention again, much of this is coming from the work of Walter Brueggemann, especially a book he wrote many years ago now called, in fact, Peace. But just like any term in the Bible, there are many meanings, and it's used differently depending on context, and the context rather matters. And there's really, Brueggemann puts this in, there's two polarities of language about peace in the Bible, and I find that helpful. It's, of course, an oversimplification, but it's an important heuristic device to be able to help us think about how does the Bible use this word. And he says, well, you might call on the one side the way that it's used among, he calls it the haves, but I would simply say for the kings and the kingship. And on the other side, for the prophets. And they both use the same term, shalom, but use it differently because the situation is so different and the context matters tremendously. But they're both part of this shalom. So what we're going to do is first go through how does this term get used, and then is there something that actually connects these things? Well, for the prophets, or this category we're calling of the prophets, it's kind of for the have-nots, meaning what is peace? What is shalom for those who have almost nothing? We see this with Moses, with Joshua, with Samuel, when the questions that they are addressing are questions of survival. Moses speaking to a people in slavery. Joshua and Samuel speaking to a people living and dwelling in the land, but are struggling in the land. The neighbors around them do not want them there. They want to eliminate them. It is and the most common posture they have toward God is crying out or groaning. Sometimes grumbling against God too, but I would say that's really the same posture, which is to say they are struggling. It is their very survival is at hand. This is when they're talking about slavery. They're being enslaved. This is what we're talking about in true survival of war and conflict, they being in the lesser party in the land. This is the very difficult space. So to call it the have-not is maybe not quite strong enough, but they're really worried about basic survival. And so then, what does shalom look like? Well, if you're crying out in slavery, in conflict, if you feel persecution, might be another term to use. That is, what is the language of shalom? Well, it's often deliverance. Deliver from a current setting, because the current setting is so awful, the only thing we can imagine is getting out of it. It is language of, we just need relief. But more than anything, it is shalom is a message of something radically new. In the New Testament, Jesus talks like this, that there is an apocalyptic eschatology, that there is fundamental evil in this world, and it needs to be conquered by God in order for them to be any kind of real new creation language, say in Corinthians. That is to say, we need something new here. So this is one way Shalom talks about it. And then that new creation, then we have the language of the harmony. And it's usually eschatological, and it's apocalyptic, meaning it's global harmony. A lot of the things we talked about in our last video, we're thinking in this manner. Well, now, if we go back to the other context, especially in the Old Testament where it's used, is for those with a very different issue. That's why we call it the kings, or so those who have things. And so people like Noah or Abraham or David or Solomon, where the issue is not survival. Whatever is going to happen to them on the table is not their destruction, at least not usually. Instead, it's a question of management and celebration of that management. And so it's often in the language of blessing. Abraham blessed, Noah blessed, David and Solomon blessed by God. And if you look at the content of those blessings, and it'd be the same with Isaac and Joseph, and so it's this whole thing about the blessing. Jacob is what is it that's really coming out of blessing? Productivity. Blessing was often tied to the legal inheritance of the land. Productivity and fertility. That you'll live forever and over by having a large family and having many, many descendants. Well, this is not a survival question for you personally. It instead was, in some language, a prosperity question. Prosperity doesn't necessarily mean you have lavish lives, but just things were going to be managed so that you could celebrate. So shalom in this context is very different, because it's not as if we can call this the haves and haves not. It makes it sound really bad for this group. The challenges they faced were very real challenges. But shalom often had to do with simply stability. If you read the narrative about David, it was unlikely that he was going to die from this. This wasn't a survival issue, but it was so chaotic. We just want stability. We want to be able to have a relationship with God that we can count on and that we can be grounded. And so it's less start something completely new, and instead, can we simply stabilize what God has given us? And we would call that shalom. And it also would look like harmony, and it would be global, and so on. But the posture is totally different. That is, the way people say, can I get a moment's peace here kind of thing. That is, that shalom is what structures us to be able to live at all. To be able to live and worship. To say that I have enough grounding that I can proclaim who God is. You notice that wasn't over here. Because over here, the primary conversation was crying out and groaning. That was their conversation with God. Here it's, I have enough stability that I can actually worship God. So here, very different uses of this word shalom. And by the way, the reason it kings, often this had to do with international affairs for the nation of Israel. Well, is there anything related at all? Some people would say, honestly, no. I mean, this is about deliverance for something new. This is about continuity for something that's there. That sounds different. Well, there's a few different things that we can gather here. The first is that it is absolutely, shalom is a gift. Peace is a gift from God. And so, no matter the context, if there is peace, it is because God is giving it to us. That's a fundamental component in a biblical theological space. The other is most obvious, is that this thing called shalom is contextual. That is to say, there is no place where this is not the goal. And it also, the Bible does not shame those who have something. It is not as if having resources is automatically wrong. Even say in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus is probably most aggressively opposed to the rich, he is more nuanced than just saying it's wrong to be rich. There's same book of James, very similarly. It sounds like it a little bit, but if you look more carefully, no, there's a nuance here. Shalom is the goal. The stability beyond shalom is for everybody, including those who have something. But then this also is shalom, that there is sometimes when you're just crying out and bringing up both things, but that it is contextual, that God's peace applies to everybody, no matter where they are, and that the way peace is produced for David, the same way for Moses, by the presence of God. The presence of God in community, the presence of God in a nation, the presence of God among a people. Very much the case which we'll talk about more next video, of the case when you look at some of Paul's letters, say in 1 Corinthians, where he's trying to bring together a community who was at odds with one another, a very kind of obvious space of peace as opposed to conflict. And Paul's argument is the only reason this can happen is because it's the presence of God among you. We'll talk about that more and what difficult space this means in an actual community setting. But first, to recognize that it is contextual and that the peace of God is contextual. No matter where you are, the peace of God is for you. That is part of a biblical theological perspective of shalom that we will be continuing to explore in the coming weeks. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.